Recording. Hello everyone, my name is Matthew VanDevander, and the name of this talk is the do's and don'ts of honest puzzle game design, which kind of, that naturally begs the question, what is an honest puzzle game? So I could put, just a bunch of pictures of different games up on the screen and say, hey, it's one of these pretty much, but I don't think that that's particularly helpful, because if you don't already understand what I'm talking about, or you haven't played these games, then that really doesn't mean anything. So I'd like to go a little bit more in depth on what I mean, by honest puzzle games. But the first thing I'd like to do is try to talk about how most games use their puzzles, which is kind of as a way of just obstructing the player's progression through the game. So maybe there's some other core gameplay, maybe you're shooting or it's a platformer or something, but the designers decided that they want to slow you down or change the pace in some way, and so they put in like a puzzle, and now you have to solve this puzzle before you can continue through the rest of the game. So this is just an example of that kind of puzzle from Monkey Island 2. But there's a lot of type of games that use this puzzle, not just adventure games. In this situation, you've come to this graveyard here, and there's a crypt here that you want to get into. But unfortunately, the door is locked, and you need to find a key. So where's that key? Well, the designer's hidden it in a totally different place, on a totally different island, far, far away. And it's on the wall here inside of this coffin shop. Unfortunately, it's behind the cash register, and the shopkeeper does not want you to go back there because he thinks you're going to rob the place. And so you kind of have to, do a little bit of coercion here and talk to him and say, hey, man, I'm looking for a good used coffin. And so he shows you this coffin over here, and, he gets a little overzealous. He's excited. Maybe you're going to buy this coffin. Nobody buys these coffins. I mean, everything's on discount here. Look. Nobody's dying. So he climbs inside the coffin to show you, hey, look how much, it'll fit you just fine. And if you happen to have a hammer that you found earlier in the game, then you can nail him into the coffin and then go get the key and, of course, go back to the crypt and unlock it. So lots of people like this game, and it's not, I'm not really trying to say that they're wrong for liking it. I mean, in fact, part of the reason that I picked this game is because I actually do like this game. Because you could think it would be really easy for me to pick a game like Gabriel Knight with like the cat hair mustache puzzle, and that everybody just kind of hates that puzzle. But I think by choosing a game that actually people do remember fondly, and remember fondly enough for it to, this is from a remake that came out quite a bit after the original game. I think by choosing a game like that people remember fondly, I can sort of make a more effective point. And that point is that people don't actually like this game for the puzzles. What they like about the game is all the layers that are on top of those puzzles. The art and the music and the funny jokes. And if we were to strip away all of that stuff, what you're left with is really just the core gameplay, which is kind of this boring sort of scavenger hunt where you're just going from place to place and you're looking for different items, random things, and you're using stuff on other stuff. And you may as well just be running around through a maze looking for a red key card, trying to unlock a red door. Only it's not even like in Doom or something, where you get to shoot some monsters on the way there, do something cool, because, in this game, the scavenger hunt is really all there is. So, if you'll permit me to continue this line of thought, and I know it's reductionist, but you could say that the set dressing in this game is really the only thing that actually gives your actions any meaning. Because the core itself, that gameplay, that scavenger hunt that you're doing, is sort of meaningless, especially if we think about it in terms of like a series of keys and locked doors. But you bubble up through those layers of production, and it sort of gathers meaning as it goes, where, okay, this key becomes a hammer, and the locked door, it turns into a coffin that you have to nail shut. So you could say, in a way, that with this type of game design, the designer is actually being kind of dishonest with you, because they're trying to trick you in a way about what you're actually doing, and make you think that something that's sort of fundamentally boring in a way is actually fun. So when I talk about honest puzzle game design, I'm really talking about like the opposite of that kind of puzzle, where the puzzle itself here is actually the core value proposition of the game. You know, and you still want to put those layers on top, right, and that makes it better, but the puzzles themselves are actually good enough to be the reason that you want to play the game. So it's kind of hard to succinctly explain exactly what an honest puzzle looks like, because so much of what that means has to do with like the subjective experience that you have when you're solving one of those puzzles. But I'll try to give an example. So this game is called The Swapper. It's a really good puzzle game. If you haven't played it, you definitely should. Especially because I'm about to spoil a puzzle in the game. It's an early puzzle. It's not a big deal, but you know, I try to be upfront. So the way the game works is that you have this device that allows you to create up to 4 clones of yourself. And the other thing that you can do with the device is you can point it at one of those clones, and then you can swap which one of the clones that you're controlling. And a little bit into the game, maybe about an hour in, it depends on, you know, how fast you're going. You come into this room here from the right, and there's this big opening in the ceiling with an arrow that's pointing up. And so when you get to it, it's obvious, you see the arrow. Well, obviously I'm supposed to go up there, but you don't really know how you could do that with the stuff that you've done so far in the game. And it's kind of a Metroidvania sort of structure where you're going around, and in those kind of games, a lot of times you pick up different power-ups throughout the game. So maybe you keep going, you'll get a jetpack or something. It's kind of this space game, so that seems like a possibility. If you had a jetpack, you could just fly right up there, right? So you keep going down to the left, and you just sort of pass up this gap here, and you solve some more puzzles, and eventually you come back here, and this is the only thing that is left. So obviously you have to be able to get up there. And so you fiddle around for a little bit, and you figure out this maneuver that's a little bit strange, but because you can make a clone of yourself up in the air and then swap to it before that clone hits the ground, you can sort of do this bunny hop maneuver where you climb up out of that pit. So when you get to this puzzle, you've been playing the game for a little while, right? And you've solved quite a few puzzles. So when you make this actual discovery, it's kind of this epiphanous moment, because there's this ability that you really had the whole time, but you just now realized it. So part of that is kind of it's this subtle feeling that you have when you make that discovery, and that's probably impossible to get across in a talk, because there's a difference between the actual experience of solving puzzles when you're playing a puzzle game versus just like watching someone else do it. Because when you're solving it yourself, it's like this realization where, you know, you're trying out different ideas, and you're sort of doing a experimentation process where you think, well, maybe this will do it, and you try something out and it doesn't work, and eventually you solve the puzzle in your head because you come up with an idea and it kind of clicks, and you try it and it's in sync. And it's kind of this beautiful feeling, whereas if you were to just watch someone else solve the puzzle, it's really like, well, I know that's possible because I saw them do it, right? So I'd like to go back to that earlier point from Monkey Island about the layers, because this game, like Monkey Island, it has those kind of layers on top of it. There's a lot of production values where there's beautiful art and music, and there's this dramatic storytelling, and the developers have clearly done a lot of work to really make the game appealing. So what would happen here if we were to kind of strip away all that polish, similar to Monkey Island? The answer is nothing really. I mean, it would make the game worse, right? It would make the game uglier in some ways, but even if you were just playing as orange boxes, it would still, in some ways, it would have the same core to it that's beautiful and interesting in some of the same ways as the final game. And that means that the game's puzzles actually have beauty at their core. And so you can still add those layers on top, but now you can be honest, and you want to be honest because you don't want to hide that beauty. You don't want to hide that thing that's great about the puzzle. You actually want to show it off and make it better if you can. So I don't really want to disparage the other type of puzzle, but I'm trying to make a point that when I talk about honest puzzle game design, I'm really just talking about kind of a different way of thinking about puzzle design. So how do we design an honest puzzle game? So I'm going to start first with sort of a broad level overview of what that design process looks like, and then I'll get into more details later. So in the first stage of the design, you're starting with an idea, and that idea is kind of a mechanic or a set of rules, but you're looking for a sort of an idea where it's a simple rule set, but you don't know all the consequences of those rules. But in the second stage, you're sort of going out, and you're like kind of an explorer. You're exploring this territory of the systems that were created with those rules. And you build out some situations, and you challenge yourself to see what you can do with that rule set. And you're looking for interesting discoveries in that. And you might find a little bit, or you might find a lot. And if you don't find much, maybe you move on to another idea, you try out some different things, and you shelve this one. You're not throwing it away, but you're putting it up so maybe later you can come back to it with fresh eyes, and maybe you'll see something about it that you didn't see before. But if you do find a lot, then you can sort of, after that experimentation process, you can move into this final part of the design process where you're actually bringing back the most interesting stuff that you found in that exploration. And you're taking basically those situations that you built to challenge yourself and refining them down, and you're curating the ideas in the game and distilling them down into a series of puzzles that sort of teach the player about the stuff that you found. And in this process, each puzzle itself is like an illustration of an interesting consequence of the rule set of your game. The player goes through and they solve those puzzles, and they're learning things as from each puzzle, and hopefully they can take that knowledge forward and solve more difficult puzzles that kind of build on that earlier knowledge. So in this type of puzzle design, it's a different type of puzzle design where every puzzle actually it has a point in the game. It's expressing something about the rules of the game, and your job as a designer is to understand what the role of that puzzle is, why it's there, and what the ideas are behind it, so that you can express that most effectively to the player. Because if a player solves a puzzle in your game and they haven't learned anything and they haven't understood why they solved the puzzle, then you've kind of failed as a game designer. So I like truthful puzzle games, and they're the kind of puzzle game that I try to design, but they seem to be kind of rare, so they must be hard to design, at least a little bit, right? So the rest of the talk is sort of more concrete tips and techniques and tools, that you can use to help you design truthful puzzle games well. And the structure of the talk is sort of a series of pairs of do's and don'ts, where each pair is kind of talking about the same thing, but they come at it from a different direction. So the first thing is kind of a broad level approach that's called designing forward. Now this was a term that I first heard coined by Jonathan Blow and Daniel Benmergui, but I was actually using this approach before I ever heard the term. So the approach and the terminology, it's a name for something that already existed, right? So there's two levels to designing forward, but they're both sort of about this fundamental unsurety that you have when you're designing about what the final result of that process is going to be. And the first level is on the whole of the project, where everything that you do is sort of couched in this experimental spirit, where you're open to new ideas and you're constantly prototyping throughout the process and trying out additional and new mechanics, a lot of times much later in development than you normally would. So I'll talk about that in a little bit, but first I'd like to talk about kind of a second level, or maybe a lower level of designing forward, which is as a method of designing individual puzzles. So what that means is that you start by building a scenario, and you're setting up a challenge for yourself. You're thinking, hey, okay, I have these rules, I have this system, I wonder if I could do this. Like, could I get over there? Could I press these two buttons? But you don't know whether or not you can do that. You just set up a scenario to try to challenge yourself to do something and see if you can. And this is a great method of design, because even if you actually can't do that thing, you can't solve the puzzle, just by challenging yourself to do something that you don't know whether you can do with the system, it puts you in this focused mindset where you're using the mechanics of the game as a tool to solve problems. And that leads you to making discoveries about how the systems in the game behave. So even if you actually can't do what you were setting out to do, you might make some discoveries or learn some things about systems in the game that lead you down the path to, building some other puzzles. Another good aspect of this design method is that because you're discovering things that surprise even you, actually, when you discover them, in some sense, those things you didn't really design, and so you can have a bit more of a more objective measure of how good those things are, because your ego is not really involved in it. You're not thinking like, oh, I'm terrible, and so all these puzzles are terrible, or oh, I'm awesome and I feel good about myself, or I want to feel good about myself, so I'm going to say that these puzzles are good even if they're not. And also, for a similar reason, you have a sort of a rough idea of how difficult the challenges are in the game, because you actually did have to solve them yourself as part of the design process. And that means that the solutions are also kind of going to gravitate towards those type of solutions that can be solved through intuition. So the natural counterpoint to designing forwards is what you might call designing backwards, or backwards design, which is a nice term, I think, because it's both descriptive of the method of design, but it also maybe implies something a little bit negative about the quality of puzzles that are designed this way. So backwards design is where we start with the puzzle and it's in sort of a solved state to begin with, and then to build the puzzle we're actually just shuffling around the pieces and asking the player to put it back together. So if there's a benefit to this method, you could say that that the difficulty of the puzzle is kind of arbitrary, because you can just shuffle up the pieces more and the puzzle gets harder. As an example, adventure games do tend to be designed with this method, where you kind of have something that's a simple situation, like, okay, as the player wants to get into the castle gardens or something, but as a designer you say, okay, well, we're going to layer on obfuscation and make that more difficult. So, first stage, well, we lock the door because, they need to lock the door. They got to find the key. Well, maybe it's too easy if they find the key, so let's make it to where they find a mold for a key. But, they can't just melt anything down in there because this is a magic door, and so they need to have gold. It has to have a golden key to unlock the door. But gold, well, if gold was just, in your inventory all the time, that would make this a really trivial puzzle. So let's make it to where gold's really rare in this land, and, nobody knows, but there's a legend that says that, there's a golden magician's chastity belt in the tower across the land, and if you could just make it there, then you could get that, and you could melt it down in the dwarven mines and fill your mold with the gold, and finally maybe you could get around to unlocking the door. So we can think of these forwards and backwards design on some kind of puzzle design continuum, where forwards design is on the right. It sort of naturally gravitates towards these puzzles that are maybe harder to design because they're designed through kind of an exploration process that's not entirely predictable, but you end up with these puzzles that are easier to solve through intuitive means, and they're also in some sense more truthful because you didn't totally specify what that solution was. You just discovered it. And then on the other end, you're going to have backwards design, where the puzzles are a lot easier to design because you're just kind of arbitrarily specifying a solution. But they're harder to solve because you also arbitrarily shuffled it up and made it more difficult. And maybe they're less satisfying that way. So most puzzles are not really totally on the right-hand side of this or totally on the left-hand side. There's some mixture, of fully truthful and a little bit arbitrary and contrived, but generally we're wanting to head towards that right-hand side of the continuum there. So let's go back to that other level, the more broad level of designing forward, which is that experimental mindset, right? So when you're designing, you want to be experimenting a lot. And the natural first step, in an experimental design process is just that you're prototyping out your ideas, because what is a prototype other than kind of an experimental version, a simple version of your game? But that begs the question of where do you get new ideas? Unfortunately, as much as I'd like to tell you that, I'm not really sure I can explain that because ideas are just kind of this mysterious thing. And if I could explain it, then ultimately I think that's going to be kind of its own lecture. But in the meantime, I'd like to answer, I feel like, a different and maybe easier question, which is actually how do you tell the difference between a good idea and a bad idea? Because of course you have to prototype your ideas to know whether they're good, but how do you even know what good looks like if you haven't seen it before? So in the past, I had a problem as a designer, and I think it actually is kind of a common problem, especially when you're starting out early, where you're sort of in the middle of this languishing project, and you believe, man, if I just work harder on this, if I just put enough stuff into it, if I just put enough good ideas into it, it's going to be great. But it's not great, and it's sort of this unfulfilling work, and you're unsatisfied. Unfortunately, the vast majority of ideas are like this. They're mundane and mediocre. And the problem with mediocre ideas is that they're not obviously bad, and they kind of seem like they could be good if you just worked a little harder, if you were just a little smarter, a little bit better. So don't fall into that trap, where you're working on a mediocre idea, because a great idea is obviously great when you find it. There's no question in your mind about whether or not it's a great thing. You don't have to think about it. So you need to continue trying out new ideas until you do actually find something that's so great that you actually can't not work on it. So I've been working on this game for a while called Duet. And there's a few different things that led into the idea, but the main one was a sense of a lack of true cooperation in games. Because even games that purported to have co-op, like the Halo games or something, really what they did is okay, well, you're the Master Chief and you're shooting some guys, and we want to have a multiplayer mode, so let's just put another Master Chief in there, but you're both shooting the same guys. But really, you're sort of acting independently. And so the original design, it just kind of came out as this scribble in Microsoft Paint. And this is just a recreation of that, because unfortunately I don't have the original drawing, because it was years and years ago, and I've had hard drive crashes since then and stuff. But the drawing was really simple. It just had this tall, narrow green character, and this short, kind of squat red one. And then arrows drawn to indicate that the green character would jump twice as high as the red one, and the red character would sort of run twice as fast as the green one. And so the idea, this really simple cooperative platformer game with these basic rules that could just be sketched out really simply, it seemed interesting, but I didn't totally know just from that what all the ramifications would be. So I built out this prototype of the game, and I was totally surprised, because there was way, way more there than I actually predicted or could have predicted or expected. And I just built the prototype in a few hours. It was a little bit janky. The controls weren't that great. The camera was this weird sluggish thing that was just the default camera in Game Maker. But the puzzles themselves were actually so good that almost everything that you see here in this prototype level has survived through to the game as it is now. And it was really this epiphanous moment as a designer, because designing this game was not like anything I'd worked on before. It was thrilling. It was so obviously better than anything else that I was working on or had ever worked on. And the ideas that I discovered, as I was experimenting with the game, were better than the ones that I actually had going in, or the ideas that I had for other projects. So, after this process, after this experience, I really couldn't think about game design, especially puzzle game design, the same way. So really what I'm trying to say is if you're not working on a project that's like that, then you just haven't found it yet. And you need to keep prototyping and trying out new ideas until you find that. So more specifically, what are we looking for in a prototype, though? How do we know that it's a good idea, right? For this kind of puzzle game. So the clearest indicator is going to be surprise, because if there's something about the game that surprised you, there's something about that you didn't totally design, right? The other thing that you're looking for is depth, and depth is the measure of the richness of the possibility space of the game. And you're looking for maximal depth with minimal contrivance. Another way of putting that is that you're looking for the most number of surprising consequences with the fewest number of rules. So again, most of your ideas are going to be mediocre. So how do you work through that slog of design and not get lost trying to polish a turd or something? And how do you maintain your motivation too when you're working on stuff and most of it's unsatisfying? So let's just do a little bit of a thought experiment. And let's say you prototyped out an idea. And when you worked on it, you discovered something so great working on it that it changes who you are as a person. And the idea is extremely generous and it just gives you back way more than you put into it and changes your life. And it's not like your other ideas where you want to work hard to make the thing great, but it's like the thing is already great, but you really want to work hard to live up to that. You want to live up to the core of the game with everything else that you're putting in. So there's a question about, how many lame prototypes would that be worth? I think it's a lot, so, don't get discouraged. So you want to take that experimentation process and sort of methodology into the rest of designing the game. So you're trying to, come up with new ideas that actually interact with your older ones in some interesting ways. So in Duet, I had an idea at one point that was sort of these blocks that would make the players float up when they were inside of them. And so I built out a level to sort of test that out, and really this was the only level I built because when I tried it out, it wasn't really that interesting. Uh-oh. Come on, Starbucks, reconnect. Okay, looks like it dropped temporarily. Okay. So I tried out these blocks, and it really wasn't that interesting because there was nothing surprising about it, and there were no consequences that I didn't initially expect. There was nothing about it that I couldn't have predicted before I designed it. And so ultimately there were not really any puzzles that came out of it, and I ended up cutting that mechanic. So eventually you're going to reach a point in the design where you've tried out a lot of different things, but you're unsure with the mechanics that you have whether or not you've explored all the possibilities. And it can be hard to be totally sure of that sometimes. But one thing that can really help is to just doodle with the elements of the game. And I mean that literally. If you have an editor, this is GameMaker, that lets you just draw out arbitrary shapes with your gameplay pieces and see what happens, then do that. Because, it kind of, by just doodling out stuff, it frees you up from, rigid structures that you might otherwise make. It might help you to make new discoveries or get some new ideas about how to make some different puzzles. It can't hurt even if you don't find anything. So you're experimenting a lot, but you don't want to forget to take out the trash because you'll be ending up with a lot of puzzles due to this exploratory kind of design process, but most of them are not going to be very good. And you have to remember that nothing that you design as part of this process is sacred, and you want to cut everything that you can if it's going to make the game better. So if you have something in the game that's not really living up to what you feel like is the potential of the game, or it's not as good as the best thing, then maybe there's a way for you to make it better, but you should also consider whether or not it actually makes the game better to just remove it completely. As an example, here's a few different puzzles from Duet, and they all are different than the puzzles that actually made it into the final game in some way. They have interesting things about them and unique aspects, but they also all had kind of annoying aspects, and the bad sort of outweighed the good. There's also this overlap a lot of times with puzzles that were already in the game, where they were just a little bit too similar, so I ended up cutting all of these puzzles. So our overall approach that I think suits truthful puzzle game design well is minimalism. And part of that is because sometimes the most beautiful puzzles are those that express subtle and maybe complex ideas, but they do it with very few elements. So you're trying to do more with less, really. And that aesthetic of minimalism, it comes out of this fundamental humility where you have a respect for the fact that the player has a limited amount of time in their life, in general, literally, but just from day-to-day too. And they could have spent that time doing anything else, but they've chosen to spend some time and maybe some of their money on your game because they believe that you're going to show them something truly beautiful. And you don't want to let them down. You want to respect that and not waste their time by asking them to do stuff like run needlessly across big open spaces between puzzles, or just play around with mechanics that are not really that interesting. Another way of putting our desire to be minimalist is to say that we don't want to be maximalist. And I know maximalist sounds like a word that I just made up, and I don't blame you. Even LibreOffice thought it was a word I made up, but it's actually a real thing. It was an art movement that was sort of a counterpoint to the minimalist art movement, only this art movement was all focused on excess. So normally it's a bit hard to give good examples from puzzle games, because if you don't understand the mechanics of the game, then there's a certain amount of explanation that has to be done to get you up to speed before you can even give an example of what you're talking about. But I think actually this example is so bad that it works better if you haven't played the game. So the way that all puzzle games work is there's a certain amount of confusion, right? Because as a player coming into a situation, you don't totally understand it, and anything that's on the screen could actually be important to the puzzle. And designing a puzzle game means you're accepting that confusion. You're accepting a certain amount of confusion, but it's important to keep things as clear and straightforward as possible. Okay, so if you played this game, then just imagine that for a second that you haven't, and you're coming into this situation, this puzzle, totally blind. How much of this puzzle actually matters? It's actually quite hard to tell, isn't it? So what I've done here is I've highlighted all of the extraneous elements of the puzzle, everything that's just decorative, and most of these things you can't even collide with. So don't do that. And you might say, well, gee, Matthew, that's really limiting, from an art direction standpoint. Maybe I want to decorate my stuff. And okay, that's the point. It's limiting, yes, because there's a limit, to how much stuff that you can put on the screen. Because when you put unrelated items on the screen, you're really obscuring the puzzle in a lot of ways, and you're decreasing the player's ability to actually understand it, and also the enjoyment that they're going to get from solving it. So what you should be doing is you should be communicating to the player where they should direct their attention. What is the relevant stuff, and limit how much extra things are going on. So another way that maximalism might manifest in puzzle games is through redundancy. So this is an example from the Talos Principle, which I actually think is a pretty good game. It has some good puzzles. There's some low points, but it's not a bad game. So I feel like this example may be a little unfair, especially because it's one of the optional puzzles in the game. But it was a good example that really kind of visually expressed redundancy. So in this puzzle, there's these series of rooms here, and in each room there's these you can see those spheres there, and those spheres are sort of these mines that move back and forth in a straight line. And if you get too close to them, they'll blow up and you have to start the whole puzzle over again. So as part of this puzzle, you're using these jammers to adjust the mine's phase, or just freeze them so you can get past them, or maybe you're just being crafty and you try to fit between, narrow spaces or something. So it's really kind of this obstacle course. But the thing about it is when you get to this puzzle, you see these three rooms, and they're all kind of the same thing, there's this redundancy going on. It feels like a betrayal of the trust as a player that you put in the game designer to not waste your time. So I think, an important thing to take away from this is if the only reason that a player would want to solve a puzzle that you put in your game is because there's a little trinket they get, and if they get 10 of those, then they get a special secret ending or something, it's probably a bad puzzle. So there's a few tools that we want to use as truthful puzzle game designers to help our puzzles express their ideas. And one of those tools is reprises. So reprises, what they are is a reiteration of surface level design for illustrative purposes. So you set up this level layout, and it's kind of a motif that you can restate later in the game. as part of a puzzle that's actually very different. A good example of reprises is Braid, because it does them a lot. So here we have two different puzzles that are both visually similar, but they're completely different when you play them. So if you haven't played Braid, you should really fix that as soon as possible. But it's this game that's about time manipulation, and it's split up into these different worlds, and in each world it explores some different aspect of how time might behave or what it means to manipulate time. So in the first version of the motif here on the left, time actually just behaves kind of normally how it does in the real world, more or less. But on the reprise on the right-hand side, time actually behaves totally differently, where it's tied to your position. When you move to the right, time moves forward, and when you move to the left, time moves backwards. So let's look at another short video from Braid. And you can see here, it's a little bit hard to tell, but on the right you can notice that time is moving backwards when the snowflakes fall up. The other thing to notice is to watch the little guys sort of move backwards. So why do we want to use reprises? Well, by echoing the structure of puzzles earlier in the game, we can give the player something kind of familiar to work with, and that makes the puzzle concepts a little bit easier to grasp. Of course, you can also use it as a method of misdirection, where the player assumes that they can solve the puzzle using the same technique because it's similar visually to the earlier puzzle, but then they're actually shocked and surprised when it turns out that the puzzle is different and their same actions have a totally different outcome. So either way, it can kind of be used as a method to create clarity where you're emphasizing how the new contrasts with the old. So while working on this talk, I designed this really short puzzle game called Opposition. It was built using PuzzleScript, which is a tool by Stephen Lavelle, and you should totally check it out because it's awesome. And the game, it has this structure where it's divided into two acts, and kind of the interesting thing about it is that the second act is like a complete level-for-level reprise of the first act. And actually here this created an interesting dramatic tension in the second act because, you know, you might, when you realize that it's all echoing the first act, you might think, oh, well, there was a puzzle that was really hard in the first act, but now it's just going to be harder because, you know, now I've got more guys to contend with, and these puzzles have all been more difficult. So though occasionally we want to reprise earlier puzzles and level layouts, reprise earlier level layouts, but for new puzzles, we don't want to repeat ourselves. Because I really want to drive home that point that reprises are not repetitive because the puzzles themselves are different and they have to be solved differently. Now it could be almost an identical puzzle, but with one piece added or removed, as long as it makes a completely different and interesting solution, it's probably worth doing. But you do want to avoid significant overlap between your motif, your original motif, and its reprise, because if the solution to the reprise is only like an alternate solution to the original puzzle, you have to remember that some players are going to solve that original puzzle with that alternate solution, and then they're going to solve them both the same way and kind of wondering why you were wasting their time with the same puzzle twice. So in that case, you want to kind of consider allowing players to maybe miss that alternate solution, or if you can, you might want to redesign the earlier puzzle to where like the more complex solution is more obvious and the simpler one is a little bit less obvious. So another tool that's kind of similar in some ways to reprises is sequences. So sequences are like a series of puzzles or parts of like a bigger puzzle that have to be solved in a specific linear order. Another way of thinking of them is like as a paragraph of puzzles, where each puzzle, you know, it might intersect with each other conceptually or even spatially or both. So Jonathan Blow's follow-up to Braid, The Witness, actually uses sequences a lot, and it does it in this very visual way. You know, in each of these scenarios, the player is solving a series of puzzle panels by drawing, you know, trying to figure out what's the correct line to draw on the panel. And the puzzles proceed from left to right, and they gradually introduce sort of an abstract idea through a series of examples and counterexamples. But inside of each puzzle panel, the player is free to explore and make mistakes and discover, through trial and error, what the correct line to draw is. But as they go through, if they're perceptive, then they can sort of build up this intuition where they end up solving the puzzles more based on understanding what the concepts that they're about are rather than just trial and error. And so these puzzles on the left are sort of about partitioning space using your line to draw between these black and white dots. The puzzles on the right, I haven't played the game, so I don't really know what they're about. So maybe I'm wrong, but I think that it's reasonable to assume that they're kind of a similar process where they're a series of puzzles that introduce this idea over time, or they introduce variations on it to allow you to understand it on a more intuitive level. So I wanted to show off sequences in kind of a different context through a live demo, but unfortunately my laptop couldn't really handle it, so I had to sort of pre-record the demo as just another video. So I'm going to go away for a little bit because I thought about doing narration alongside it live, but it didn't really work out, so it just sort of worked better to record it. But if I go away, then at least you're not watching me play a live demo.
So this is from the C++ version of Duet. This is kind of just an example of what a sequence might look like in a different style of game than the Witness. So this is at the beginning of the second world in the game, so it's not that far into the game. And kind of the main change in this world is that the players can collide with each other and push each other around, which is sort of, what you would expect. And this is just a really basic sequence, and it kind of, it really is one puzzle, but it has these steps to it where each step is kind of its own thing. Both figuratively and literally, because we do have this sort of staircase thing going on. And so we have this first step here where the red player can't jump up this ledge because it's too high, and the green player can quite easily make it up there because the green player has a double jump. Actually, the green player can make it all the way up here, but they can't make it up this wall. And so the players kind of just have to work together, where the green player gives the red player a boost here, and then they can get up there. But then on the second one, the red player can't make it just by jumping, and so they have to both work together with jumping, where the green player jumps and then the red player jumps. Actually, I'm not even sure the red player needs to jump. I think, yeah, okay. The red player can just kind of walk over the ledge. But the third one requires the green player to jump twice, and then the red player can't actually walk over that ledge. The red player has to jump as well. And because the green player couldn't make it up here before, now that the red player's up there, who's the only one that can get up there, if they work together, just, through their physics interactions. But now the red player can hold down a button, and the green player can make it up here and solve the puzzle.
So why do we want to use sequences? Well, for a similar reason to using the reprises, because the subject matter that we're trying to communicate through a puzzle might be a little bit subtle or difficult to grasp. And sequences allow us to break up a bigger puzzle into kind of a series of bite-sized chunks so that the player can solve each chunk and use those as like stair steps towards understanding the core idea. And that makes puzzles easier, which sort of brings up this interesting point, which is, normally you might think that a good puzzle has to be difficult, right? But actually no, because as part of this puzzle design type, making hard puzzles is not really the goal. It's just sort of a natural side effect of having deep subject matter. Your goal is communicating that subject matter and communicating the ideas effectively. And difficult ideas are just naturally going to be a little bit difficult to grasp, but easy ones should be easy to grasp, and you don't want to make them harder. So a good example of of how that, of how that trying to make things easier works out in practice is Miegakure, which is this puzzle platformer that's in 4 spatial dimensions. And so if you think about what does the 4th spatial dimension mean, you could see how it would be really easy to design a game about that that's impossible to understand and maybe impossible to even play. But instead, what Miegakure tries to do is it tries very hard to reduce down that complexity of that concept while still really maintaining a true, 4th dimensional space. So the design of the game is actually about making the beauty of the 4th dimension more appreciable to the human senses. And allowing players to maybe intuitively grasp kind of what the 4th dimension feels like, or what that means, at least in some small sense. So although we want to make sequences when we can, and make our concepts that are difficult concepts easier to grasp, we want to avoid creating labyrinths. So what is a labyrinth? Well, we all know it's a movie with David Bowie in it, with crazy hair, and I don't know, what is he holding there? I mean, look at that. That's just weird. But in the context of puzzle games, a labyrinth is sort of similar to the classical idea of a labyrinth, which is the structure that's kind of similar to a maze, but the main difference is that it has no branches. And the only difficulty that it has is really just through being long and arduous. There's no real way to get lost unless you just fell asleep or spun around a lot and forgot which way you were going. So you might think of a labyrinth in a puzzle game as being like a straightforward but elaborate puzzle that's built up of a series of trivial elements. Maybe another way of thinking of it is as like a boring sequence. So labyrinths come out of that difficulty-oriented mindset about puzzle game design that I talked about earlier, where you sort of feel like it's required that the puzzles in your game be difficult. So when I was first designing the puzzles for Duet, I sort of found myself in that situation where I was really inspired a lot by Braid, but part of what I liked about Braid was that a lot of the puzzles were pretty tricky. But here I was designing this game that for the most part the puzzles were pretty easy, and some of them were so easy that maybe they weren't puzzles. I mean, they were interesting, but I started to feel a little bit insecure and worried about that maybe people would think the game was too easy and maybe they wouldn't like it for that. And so what I proceeded to do is I designed this puzzle that was really complicated, but it was built up out of a lot of simple elements. It took longer to solve, but it was just because it had a whole bunch of steps that were really straightforward individually. There was this interesting feeling to the puzzle in some ways, but it was also really unsatisfying, and it was probably the worst puzzle that I designed. So I ended up cutting the puzzle. But usually when I cut things, I don't just totally forget about it. Instead, I kind of think about, well, there was something about that. And so I stowed that away in the back of my mind because I didn't know what to call that thing. But then I played the Talos Principle, and here's another maybe negative example from the Talos Principle. But and later in the game, there was this puzzle that was called the Labyrinth. So here's a screenshot of the puzzle. It's sort of a bird's eye view. Unfortunately, as I said earlier about puzzle games, it's sort of hard to explain the details of the puzzle because, there's been a lot of mechanics introduced over the game, and it takes hours to introduce those mechanics. But suffice to say that this puzzle had the exact same feeling as that puzzle that I had designed in Duet. So now I knew what the name for it was because this puzzle had a name, and that name was Labyrinths. So, kind of the aspect of labyrinths is that they're trivial to solve, right? And that can be for a couple reasons. They could just be like a repeat of things that were actually difficult earlier in the game, things that were quite challenging, but now you've sort of done them a million times, and so, they're just simple. Or it could be stuff that you've done in a lot of other games, or, it could just be plain trivial. Labyrinths could be defined as a puzzle that is arduous to execute, mostly from like a time standpoint, but it's conceptually very simple to grasp. But you kind of want the opposite of that, right? You want puzzles that are easy to execute once you actually understand them, but they're complex conceptually, and so they might be difficult to grasp. But again, difficulty is not the goal. because you don't want to make concepts harder than they already are. So let's go back to forwards design and experimentation. So we want to iterate on the design of the puzzles in the game. And iteration is sort of experimentation, but within the context of an individual puzzle. So we're not trying to come up with new puzzles or new mechanics, but we're just trying to improve one puzzle. And since the puzzles in this type of truthful puzzle game, honest puzzle game, are intended to express, certain ideas about the systems underlying the game, it's possible that there's better or worse ways of expressing the same thing. And if you can, you want to try out different versions of the puzzle and look for maybe what is the best version of whatever it is that expresses those ideas. So here's another example from Duet. And this is a very early puzzle in the game, and it kind of introduces two ideas. One is this button and block relationship, where what happens when you press down these buttons, and it creates a block that appears when you press the button down. And the other is the relationship between the two players' differing jump heights, as that has an effect on making it over vertical obstacles. So there's a few different versions here. So you've got the first version, that's sort of the basic, original prototypical version of it, where you just have a button, and when you press that button, the green block there appears. But then I tried another version where I used this different type of button that actually sort of works in an opposite method, where when you press the button down, the blocks are already there, but when you press the button down, the blocks disappear. But if you think about it, structurally, it's pretty much the same thing as the first puzzle. But the only real difference is that the button has gotten moved up on top of the ledge. So I tried out a version with the original block mechanic with the button up on top of the ledge, but ultimately I moved it back to the original method because there was something about it to where when you put the button before the wall, you could be sure that the player wasn't missing any information when they were trying to solve the puzzle. When they were trying to get the red player up above the wall who can't jump as high, you were sure that they didn't know you were sure that they were aware of what the button did. And then on the bottom right here is the current version, which adds this little pit here that's kind of a reinforcement of that smaller ledge concept, to kind of solidify that idea in the player's mind about the difference between the height of these walls, because one wall is exactly half as tall as the other. Of course, that adds a little bit of complexity there, so I may iterate it some more and decide to remove that. Although we want to iterate and we want to try to have the best versions of our puzzles, in that process it can be very easy to slip into perfectionism. And you don't want to be satisfied completely because that's part of your drive towards excellence, but you have to remember that it's never going to be perfect. So I'd like to read a little bit of an excerpt from Art and Fear, which is a book by David Bales and Ted Orland, and this excerpt is called Perfection. The ceramics teacher announced on opening day that he was dividing the class into two groups. All those on the left side of the studio, he said, would be graded solely on the quantity of work they produced, and all those on the right side solely on its quality. His procedure was simple. On the final day of class, he would bring in his bathroom scales and weigh the work of the quantity group, 50 pounds of pots rated an A, 40 pounds of pots a B, and so on. Those being graded on quality, however, needed to produce only one pot, albeit a perfect one, to get an A. Well, came grading time and a curious fact emerged. The works of highest quality were all produced by the group being graded for quantity. It seems that while the quantity group was busily churning out piles of work and learning from their mistakes, the quality group had sat theorizing about perfection and in the end had little more to show for their efforts than grandiose theories and a pile of dead clay. So perfection is a nice goal, but it's unachievable, and at some point you have to release a game even when it's not perfect. So the final thing that you want to do is you want to break all of these rules. Don't listen to me. Following a set of guidelines too strictly will lead you down a path of making cold, impersonal games. So these aren't strict rules, but they're just tools in your toolbox. In a similar way, sour and bitter by themselves can kind of be unpleasant tastes. but an expert chef can wield them as tools to create delicious and balanced flavors. So I'd like to do a little bit of a brief addendum about story. I'm not really usually a stories in games type of person. I do like some story-focused games, but in my own designs, I've tended to avoid story. Oftentimes, you have to admit that stories in games are just kind of worse versions of stories in other types of media. But I've started to think about story in context of puzzle games a little bit more recently and started thinking about how I might use that, and so I think I might have some useful thoughts there. So I want to mention this quote from Ralph Koster's Theory of Fun that's always sort of stuck with me, in which he explained that story in games is sort of always destined to be a side dish for the brain, where the main course is the mechanics or the gameplay. And I think we can sort of easily draw a parallel between story in games and pictures or illustrations in books. And I believe for honest puzzle games, maybe the best use of story is to embrace that and use it as an illustration, where the written word itself is kind of maybe able to approach the same concepts as the rest of the game, but providing a different perspective. So I'd like to leave you with just a final thought. There's this gap between your ability to specify the rules of a system and your ability to predict or perhaps even understand the resulting consequences. In that gap are beautiful things, ideas for which you can only take partial credit for, which were discovered more than designed. These ideas, you have a different relationship to them than your other ideas, because you did not come up with them whole cloth, but instead, through cooperation with some greater part of the universe which you didn't and perhaps cannot understand. Thank you. So if you liked or didn't like the talk, you can, of course, reach me on Twitter. And if you really like the talk, then you could consider supporting me on Patreon. I have a Patreon there where you can toss me a couple cents for things like this that I do. Just a suggestion. You don't have to do that. I'd also like to encourage you to check out, there's a couple talks here. One is a talk from Indicade called Designing to Reveal the Nature of the Universe. It was given by Jonathan Blow and Marc Bosch. And it's sort of, there's a lot in that talk that kind of inspired this talk. If you've seen that talk, then you would kind of know that. But it's kind of always stuck with me. And another talk, also by Jonathan Blow, that was given at In Development, is called Attempting Deep Work. And that sort of goes into that bit about where ideas come from that I wasn't really sure how to talk about intelligently. And the last thing is this sort of group interview called A Good Puzzle Game is Hard to Build. It's at Rock, Paper, Shotgun. It was written by Marsh, Davies, and there's some interesting thoughts there about puzzle games too. So with that, I will conclude, and if anyone wants to, I can take questions now. So questions, anybody want to take questions or give questions and I'll answer them? Just about anything. Or preferably about things in the talk. Oh, nobody prepared their questions. That Twitch delay. Nobody has any questions? No questions? Really? Okay, Mr. Fourth Dimension, any ideas on how the same concepts can extend outside of puzzle games? Sure. I mean, I think there's an exploration design process that you can take that into other kinds of games. Where you're not trying to come at it from a standpoint like, hey, I want to make this game that is about like a cool robot or something, but instead you're thinking of like a mechanic or a rule set, and you're still exploring and you're trying out different ideas and seeing where that goes. It's just you don't use that to make puzzles, but maybe you use it to make other types of gameplay where it's less about achieving an individual goal, and it's more about you're just paying attention to the mechanics of the game and trying to think about how maybe you could alter them a little bit and how that might create some interesting gameplay. I don't do a whole lot of non-puzzle game designs, and so I'm probably not the person to really talk about that much, but that's my take there. Ezio Auditoreves, I'm not really sure how you pronounce your name there, but what is my favorite puzzle of any puzzle game? Of any puzzle game? Probably, well, my favorite puzzle game is Braid. That's probably obvious. And that answers the next question there by Thorn Black. And my favorite puzzle in Braid, well, that's hard to say, but I tend to think like my favorite one is there's that one in World, I think it's World 5. Yeah, 5 is the one where you have the parallel universe and you have to like kill your shadow to give you the key, and there's no name for the puzzle because it's just so weird. That's one of my favorite puzzles in that game. I like the star puzzles a lot too, but I don't really want to spoil any of the star puzzles. Yeah, okay. Let's see. What type of game would I make? Well, I'm making a game. I'm making a game called Duet. It's a 2-player cooperative platformer where you cooperate and you solve puzzles. If you missed that part of the talk, I showed a little bit of it. There's a video you can find on my YouTube channel. So I guess that's the type of game that I'd make. Puzzle games that are like that. I like that game. I think it's a good game. It's been kind of like, it's been a long and crazy journey working on that one, and it's still not close to done. But it'll get there eventually. Any more questions? Ezio Auditore. Not really a question by Martin Cohen, one of the Patreon backers. Actually, a lot of removing distractions is pretty much covered in other fields, user interface usability, so you can have complex art as long as you make sure that the important parts are clear. Yeah, I think that's really, that's really what I'm trying to say is like you don't want to obscure what's actually important about the game, and it can be easy to do that. Especially when you're working into the art design standpoint, because some of your goals, just from a pure aesthetic point of view of making something that looks good on the screen might conflict with your other goals about how do you actually make the puzzle intelligible. Like for a platformer, it might be really important that you have a clear, sharp, right angle edge for this puzzle or something. But from an aesthetic point of view, that might not work well because you had it set in this nature setting, and maybe you just have to kind of think about what you can do there. What do I think? See, this is from Drive 137. What do I think of a lot of people never getting something 1.0? Like never finishing things? Well, I'm one that never finishes things because I've been working on the same game for like 4 years now, right? And it's not close to done. But I think one of the things that I've started to learn there is that a good thing to do is build up that as a skill. Like finishing things is actually a skill that you want to build up. And so the easiest things to finish are really small things. And so if you set like a intentionally constrained project, either you say, okay, I'm going to make a game in a week, or I'm going to make a game in a month, and you don't let it blow out past that, or I'm going to make a game in an afternoon even. With something like Puzzle Script, I made that game in an afternoon. So I think that's a good way to, get yourself in that training of finishing things and get better at that. And then maybe that works in some way towards bigger projects. I don't know, because, the big project, finishing the big project is really it's a different animal in a lot of ways, and that can be about maintaining motivation and not burning yourself out, because I did that definitely. So, you know, it's about making steady progress on that, but not pushing yourself and forcing yourself to do things that you actually don't want to do. So I don't know. I don't really know. Maybe that helps. Maybe that's useful thoughts there. I know Ezio Auditore is the main character of Assassin's Creed 2, but you've got like Auditore VS at the end there. So I don't know what's going on there. Let's see. Martin Cohen asks, are there any other games besides Braid and the ones you mentioned that are interesting from a puzzle design perspective? Perhaps games that are not only about puzzles, but use puzzles well to support their message. Well, it might be worthwhile to go back to the second slide there. Let me see here. I got to get to where I can even see what I'm doing. Okay, so let's go back to that first slide. Come on. I got too many slides here. There's no easy way to jump back, as far as I know, to the first slide. Come on now. Come on now. Here we go. So yeah, any of these games here, definitely. Some of them are not out. The Witness is not out. Miegakure is not out. But yeah, so any of these games, Miegakure, The Witness, Braid, The Swapper, Antichamber, Relativity, Portal, any of those games I think are good examples of puzzles. I haven't played some of these, but just from looking at them, I can tell that they're in this vein of puzzle game, and they're certainly worth looking at. But definitely the ones over on the right, Braid, Swapper, Antichamber, and Portal, I have played, and I can tell you are definitely worth looking at as far as, you know, being interesting about puzzle design and you can take kind of good lessons from those. As far as using puzzles and where they're not totally the focus, but puzzles support the message of the game, I don't know exactly. I think Portal's the only one there that's kind of like where the story is totally separate from the puzzles, but kind of works in a way. Talos Principle is similar to that, but you notice that I didn't put it here because there's a lot of misgivings I have about that game. It's worth checking out, but as far as, you know, using puzzles to tell a story or something, or communicate a message, I think it really kind of flails when it tries to do that. Yeah, so I don't know. I don't think I'll really spend much more time on just that. Thorn Black asks, do you work alone on your game? What part of your time goes into the game? On Duet, I am not working alone. I am working with an artist named Eric Ronblom out of Sweden. And he's a really great guy. However, it can be kind of difficult sometimes to coordinate with somebody who lives in Sweden, because that's pretty far away, a different time zone and all that. And how much of my time goes into the game? Well, that's varied very significantly over the project. At the start of the project, it was a lot of time. It was almost all of my time. I worked on it 14 hours a day, every day. But then I burned myself out because there were days where I didn't want to work on it, but I forced myself to sit down and work on it for 14 hours straight. But now it's maybe, I'm lucky if I can get 2 hours a day on it, but I certainly don't work on it every day. And for the past month and a half, I haven't worked on it at all. Currently, I'm in the process of porting it over to Unity off of my custom engine into Unity, because that seems like that's going to work better. Mostly because the custom engine needs just like major surgery, and so it was kind of like there was a toss-up between, am I spending, 3 to 6 months rebuilding the engine, or am I spending that time just porting it over to an engine that kind of works better and it's easier to expand on. So that's sort of what I'm doing there. Starchy Pancakes. How do I feel about strategically limiting sensory information given to the player as a puzzle mechanic itself? For instance, only having sound in one level or deliberately obfuscating portions of the puzzle space. As far as deliberately obfuscating, I don't know. I mean, maybe there's... the only game I can think of that does that in an interesting way is not really a puzzle game. That's Space Giraffe, which is a game by Jeff Minter, and it's sort of like Tempest in some ways, but the game is almost entirely about increasingly throwing distracting stuff on the screen, and you're trying to actually see the game through that. So that's interesting, but I don't know about for a puzzle game, because like a puzzle game is already kind of confusing in some ways, and I don't think it feels good to layer more confusion on top of that. It's just not really a great thing to try to do. Let's see. Better see those games played. What games played? Oh, that's the auditory, sorry. How is the text editor coming? The text editor is not coming. I've pretty much abandoned the text editor. Sorry. I worked on it for a little while. It was interesting. I learned, I guess, a lot about writing stuff in a very low level on Linux, and that was cool. I learned about UTF-8, text encoding, and that was fun. But at a certain point, I kind of felt like, yeah, this text editor project's too big. It's too much work. And if I'm going to put this much work into something, I should probably actually put it into Duet. And I started to feel like maybe I wanted to work on Duet when I haven't felt like I wanted to work on Duet for about about 2 years now. I haven't felt like I wanted to work on Duet. So there's been about 2 years of the past 4 years that I actually haven't worked on Duet almost at all. I did a couple of prototypes during that time and some other stuff, and I've done videos and writing and things like that, but I just burned myself out so bad. It was like, I just need a break from this. And Eric was working at EA at the time, and he was busy, and so he couldn't really work on it anyway, so it was a good time for me to take a break. Etsy Auditory Revs. Kind of unrelated, but from playing Braid, what parts of the engine I think John was able to reuse for The Witness? I don't know. I don't know much about the engine or how it works. Certainly from talks and things of seeing like the editor interface is still pretty similar. I know that the sound, he talked about the sound in Braid, and he said that the sound in The Witness is still done the same way, which is kind of a weird way where when a sound is playing, like there's an entity in the world that exists that is that sound. And then there's a different sound layer on top of that that looks at the entities there and says, oh, there's an entity here and it's playing a sound. And so then it's kind of like another layer of indirection. But I really don't know. Like I'm not working on that game. I don't know John, and I don't really know that much about the internal functionings of the engine. But, if it's anything like my own stuff, it's kind of like, well, I just kind of take the last game that I was working on and I copy it over and then like delete some things, and it slowly turns into the next game. So if there's something in there that worked for the next game, then it will stay in there. Can you promote your free puzzle game here? Sure, go ahead, post it if it's free, whatever. Yeah, so if anybody has any more questions, I can answer more questions, but the laptop battery here is getting kind of close to dying, and so I think it might be worth concluding the Q&A. But I'd like to encourage anybody, if they like to talk, again, to check out the Patreon. I'll post a link. Patreon, how do you spell that? I will post a link in the chat, so you can check out the Patreon if you want to then you can back the Patreon. If you back at $1 or more for this kind of thing, then you can get the archive version of this 24 hours sooner than everybody else. And so that would be the first thing that you get charged for on there. It would just be $1, and then you can look at that. If not, if you don't want to back it, then that's fine. I understand. Also keep in mind, as part of that, it's $1 a thing, but you can set a maximum amount per month because, you got to budget your stuff out like that, and you don't want to spend too much money on stuff like this. But if you want to get it earlier, then you get that there. If not, then you'll just get it a day later than the Patreon backers. But again, oh yeah, well, I should answer that question for Martin Cohen. Is there any other talk or content that I plan to do? Yes, there is actually. However, I feel like I want to take a week off because I have just been like killing myself to finish this thing in time. I set Saturday and I'm like, okay, Saturday, oh, it's too far away. But then it was like, oh, I kept getting ideas, and it was just like, I don't have enough time, gosh. So I wasn't sleeping that much this week. So I think I'll take a week off. But what I want to do is I want to do something where I go in depth and talk about opposition, because I think a lot of what helps as far as understanding puzzle game design and how that works is really specific details. So I feel like it might be worthwhile doing something like that. I don't know whether it's going to be another stream or if it's just going to be a video. And as far as other content, I have a series that there's a couple pilot episodes on YouTube called Why Games Matter. I want to do more of that sometime. And of course, I want to work on more games. But again, thank you all for watching. I think that this went pretty well, and I hope that you do too. And I hope if I do anything else that you'll be along for the ride. It's been fun doing this. It's been exciting. It's a little bit of a different thing for me to do. So we can enjoy the ride together or whatever. So thank you for watching, and I'll see you all around.